welcome to the session on teaching the Aeneid and on teaching Augustine, I believe primarily the Confessions. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. The idea of these sessions was to help those who may be teaching any number of the great books, either at home, in the homeschool context, or in a classical classroom, or in any classroom whatsoever. And so we'll be talking through a little bit, just some approaches to the great books. And so I've passed around a handout. I'm going to leave some more over here by the computer in case anyone didn't get one. And for those watching in video format, we will attach that in some way. But on the handout, I've included a number of key passages and key terms that I use when addressing the Aeneid with students at OBU, which means that some of you guys will have already heard this. But I'm going to try to explain in the next 15 minutes what we do in those, depending on the class, three days or a week and a half. A quick word on translation. If you're teaching the Aeneid in translation, there are a number of good ones. I like Rolf Humphrey's translation as well, but we use Stanley Lombardo's translation in classes at OBU because we find that the colloquial nature of the language makes the poem more approachable for the students. And so when teaching the Aeneid, when teaching most ancient texts that are going to seem distant to students, I find it's best to give them a handle on the poem. And so my thematic approach focuses on the theme of order and chaos. So when I teach the Aeneid, I usually focus on order and chaos and on emphasizing Aeneas as a model of virtue. Come on in. There are some handouts. I can approach them without a mask if I'm related. And this is just a way to help the students kind of have a grasp on things. So I like to organize the poem in a sense for them on the theme of order and chaos. Often, in fact, I tell them just make a column, 2 columns in your notebook, in your notes for the course, so you can drop characters in as we go. And this is simply a lens for shaping their understanding and for organizing my approach. I know a lot of times when I teach a text, I need some way to manage to not tell them everything all at once. And so this theme helps me do that. The theme also helps incorporate historical background, context into the poem in important ways. So for instance, I usually tell them that Virgil's exploration of order and chaos isn't a dry academic matter for him. He's lived through the civil wars leading up to the establishment of the Augustan regime in Rome. And so he has experienced chaos in a way that creates a kind of deep yearning for order. So this is why I banish from our conversation about the poem the word propaganda. So often this poem gets reduced to propaganda for Augustus and his regime. And I think that is an incredibly reductive way to look at a great poem. The poem explores order and chaos not as simply political elements, but as the major principles of reality in the cosmos. Right? Virgil sees human life as a struggle between order and chaos on the micro level and on the macro level. And so I usually begin my discussion of the poem by looking at the two key passages in book one. So I usually don't start at the very beginning of the book. I like to do this first and then back up to the beginning of the book. So I tend to start with Aeneas on the prow of his ship, and I've given you passages with line numbers that are from the Lombardo translation in your handout. But the poem, early in the poem, Aeneas is at sea, as those of you who have already read it or are already teaching it know. And Juno has stirred up the winds to drown his fleet, and the waves are crashing, and everything is in chaos around him. And Aeneas stands calmly in the prow of the ship and gives a deeply felt but also highly rhetorically ordered oration. 2 times, 3 times better it would have been to die on the fields of Ilium than to drown here. And so Virgil, very early in the poem, gives us this image of Aeneas as a man, as a human being, standing against this cosmic force of chaos represented by Juno. And then I like to contrast that with Juno's first appearance in the poem, which is sort of this raving, self-focused speech about how insulted she is by everything. And for students, this sets up this key dichotomy in the poem. And it helps them see Virgil's point really here, that it's not necessarily the gods who stand opposed to this universal force of chaos. It's Aeneas the man, making choices for himself, pursuing his fate, right? But choosing to pursue his fate. And so this is part of the poem's focus on virtue. And I like to tell my students one of the most important things to note, because they've all read the Iliad and they've seen what heroism is for Homer, is that Aeneas isn't man-killing Aeneas, even though he's very tough, right? He doesn't have that epithet of man-killer that Achilles has, right? And he's not Aeneas, breaker of horses. He's pious Aeneas, pious Aeneas. And so his heroic epithet points to not his prowess, though it's considerable, but to his virtue, which of course in the Latin virtus, right, is related to manliness. The poem makes a direct connection between manliness and virtue. And so then it becomes very much just a procedure of looking at how Aeneas embodies the sorts of virtues that make for orderly life, an orderly city, state, an orderly empire, and order in the cosmos. And so you can see some of the key themes for that. I like to focus them, for instance, on the Homeric Simile in Book 1, line 177. And I'm just going to read that because you can't talk about the Aeneid without reading the Aeneid. It's like a crime. So when, early in the poem, Jupiter finds out Juno has stirred up the winds to drown Aeneas' men, and Neptune has found out, and he's angry, right? Because this is his domain, this is his imperium, the sea, and so he goes and he calms the waves. And this is the simile, the comparison that Virgil uses. He says, "Riots will break out in a crowded assembly when the rabble are roused. Torches and stones are soon flying. Fury," of course in the Latin that's the furor, which is that personified force of chaos. "Fury always finds weapons, but then all eyes light upon a loyal citizen, a man of respect, a man of dignitas," which was one of the key values of the poem. The crowd stands still in hushed expectation and with grave words. So there's that Roman virtue, gravitas, that I also emphasize with students. He masters their tempers and calms their hearts. Now, of course, this simile of this unnamed man of great dignitas and gravitas, great seriousness and dignity, gestures toward Augustus, right, as the man who's bringing order and peace to the empire. But it also reflects on Aeneas. And this is Virgil's point, that if there's going to be order, then it's going to take sacrifice. If there's going to be order, it's going to take sacrifice. And I think this is one of the things that most redeems the poem from that sort of charge of being mere propaganda. There's this wonderful passage in Book 2 when Aeneas has just arrived on the shores of Carthage. And famously, we know what happens in Carthage. There's the big love affair with Dido that results in the worst breakup in literary history. But when he gets there, they see the story of the Trojan War depicted on the side of a temple. It happens to be a temple to Juno. And when Aeneas looks at it, he says, "Sunt lacrimae virum." These are the tears of things. These are the tears of things. And so this is his way of saying, essentially, look, this is human life. To be human is to suffer. Right? And of course, the student who has read the Iliad and read the Odyssey, not to mention maybe the book of Job, has contemplated this truth already. And we see then in the Aeneid how Virgil picks up that Homeric view of suffering as inevitable in human life and recasts it in terms of this Roman struggle for order. Human life is full of suffering, and therefore we should expect to suffer for anything that is good. We should expect to suffer for anything that is good. And so that's the major theme in the poem of the cost of order, or the cost of imperium, the cost of bringing a kind of peace through order to the world. And that helps the students then understand key moments in the poem, like the death of Creusa. Right? A lot of times, it's easy to read the poem and just get mad at Aeneas, right? He seems to have just left his wife behind, and now she's dead, and that was pretty negligent, right? But that's not really Virgil's point. Virgil's point is that there is a great cost to this establishment, this bringing of order to the world, which really then sets us up quite well for the great story of Book 4. And students will inevitably want to focus on the story of Dido and Aeneas. I think Dr. Callis could testify that half of the Civ exams we give the students just mainly talk about Dido and Aeneas. For some reason, passionate love and brutal breakups are on the minds of college students, I guess. But usually they go into that story wondering why Aeneas would make the choice he makes. Why would he abandon Dido? And so they jump to conclusions, well, he's just heartless, right? Well, that's not what the poem says. The poem says Aeneas felt the love for Dido deep in his heart. So why does he leave her? Because he chooses duty over love. And this is part of Virgil's theme of the cost of order, the cost of imperium. Obviously, if we were to reduce the poem to propaganda, we might say that one thing Augustus would like to see encouraged in Romans is the ability to choose duty over love. Because if nobody does that, you have no army. You have to have people willing to sacrifice their heart, their personal life for the greater good of order. But it's also part of this tragic theme. Aeneas suffers when he leaves Dido. Virgil tells us he feels it deep in his heart. So once they understand that the poem's not just about kind of order is good and chaos is bad, but that human suffering is required for there to be good, then they can understand that there's so much more depth to that Dido and Aeneas story. And they can understand other deeply moving moments in the poem. The end of Book 3, when Aeneas is narrating his travels, and he comes to the part where Anchises, his father, dies. If you look closely at what Aeneas is saying, he breaks off suddenly. He just can't bear to tell the story anymore. And so we see, again, that theme of suffering in the poem and loss, what Aeneas loses along the way, what Aeneas loses on that journey. And this is a theme I think should resonate deeply with the Christian reader. Suffering on the journey to redemption. And so some of the key themes I have for you on there that touch on this. Certainly the death of Anchises, the death of Callis. I'm trying to speed up now because I'm trying to do the whole poem in 3 minutes. I would add probably a key scene for thinking about that, a key passage for thinking about that is the great story of Nisus and Euryalus in Book 9. Nisus and Euryalus, these young men who are best friends. And then they, surprisingly, for young men who are best friends, they egg each other on to do something incredibly reckless. Right? But Virgil doesn't scorn them for that. He says, as long as this poem is read, Nisus and Euryalus will be praised. Right? And so there's this sort of theme of noble sacrifice in the story of Nisus and Euryalus, and maybe of the kind of recklessness required in a young man to make that kind of noble sacrifice. So that is an incredibly quick summation of how I read the Aeneid. Dr. Callis is going to talk about Augustine, and then maybe we'll do some questions and see how we can most help you as you teach these texts.
Andy, you want to bring this to you? As a helper, hand those out. Okay. See, got books here. Don't have room for them on the podium. So I'm Jonathan Callis, and I teach English here as well. If you think about the Aeneid as a struggle between order and chaos, almost at this cosmic level, the same theme plays out in Augustine's Confessions, but in an interior way. It's about the soul as it struggles to put down the restless will, in a sense. And I'll talk through that. But there's a philosopher named Charles Taylor who writes about this process in a book called Sources of the Self. He says that in the interior you find the man. In the interior, in the soul you find the man. And Augustine gives you, in one sense, an Aeneid of the soul. And actually, some of the places that Augustine stops off at on his journey, he goes from the interior of Africa to Carthage to Rome, following the same path as Aeneas. He just happens to go back to Africa eventually. But the main way I want to explain The Path of the Confessions for Augustine, which is just a remarkable book. If you have not read it, you should read it. It is both an ancient and a modern book at the same time. There are things in the book that you won't understand unless you know some things about late antiquity, and even if you know a lot about what's called the late antique period, you still won't understand them. And yet, the voice in the Confessions is personal, it's autobiographical, and as Augustine's most famous biographer, Peter Brown, who's just an astounding scholar, he's written dozens of books about this period and about Augustine. He calls Augustine a romantic with a capital R, that Augustine is always about yearning, about the longing for God, the restlessness we have until we rest in Him. And that's one reason I love Augustine so much. I love the Romantic poets, and I find echoes in them of Augustine's quest, and I think Augustine in many ways is a better romantic than the Romantics. But Augustine's quest is a quest ultimately for wisdom, for a knowledge of who God is, the triune God. And if you read the Confessions, he is a pilgrim sort of on the way to finding out who God is and seeking a way to have communion with that God. And one of the principal ways that you have communion with God is that you see Him in others. So love, in some sense, what you would call eros, right? The love of longing, the love of lack. You feel the need, you feel that you're missing something, and you see it in somebody else. So if you've ever had a really, really strong friendship with somebody else, in some ways that friendship is not completely equal, but you see the other person has qualities or virtues that you lack, you chase after them. You want to know them and find those things and embody them in the same way. So I started out on the handout with a passage from the Bible that really captures this idea of wisdom in creation. So Augustine was obsessed with the creation story. He wrote many books about Genesis. In fact, the end of the Confessions is about Genesis in a lot of ways. But Proverbs 8 is about wisdom, the wisdom of God from before the creation of the world, bringing it into existence. So I'll read some of it. I'm not going to read through this whole passage right here, but I leave it for you. This passage in many ways explains what Augustine is looking for his whole life long. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of His work, the first of His acts of old. Ages ago I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no springs abounding with water, before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills I was brought forth, before He had made the earth with its fields, or the first of the dust of the world. When He established the heavens, I was there. When He drew a circle on the face of the deep, when He made firm the skies above, when He established the fountains of the deep, when He assigned to the sea its limit, and so on. And then he talks about wisdom being there. Solomon talks about wisdom being there with God as a master workman. So part of what Augustine is doing in the Confessions is trying to understand who made him. If you know William Blake's poem, The Lamb, little lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? Right? It is the simplest question anyone can ask. And it is the most profound. And that's the question that Augustine's trying to answer. Who made me? And how did He make me? So if you skip down underneath that, I've quoted from a German Catholic philosopher named Joseph Pieper, who wrote a book on the 4 classical virtues, well worth reading. He also has a book or a book of books called Faith, Hope, Love, and both of them together are a wonderful summation of sort of the 7 virtues. But he says this. He says, the man who does good follows the lines of an architectural plan which has not been conceived by himself and which he does not understand as a whole, nor in all of its parts. This architectural plan is revealed to man from moment to moment. In each case, he sees only a tiny segment of it as through a tiny crack. So I want you to think about this image right here. An architectural plan which has not been conceived by himself and which he does not understand as a whole. That's what Confessions is doing. Confessions is about the wisdom of God that brought the world into existence, but Augustine didn't didn't build the house. He didn't write the story. God is the storyteller. God built the house, but you're contributing to it, right? You're building it along with him, even though you don't know what it's going to look like. And so there's a moment in Confessions where Augustine runs across this lost work by Cicero called Hortensius, and it fills him with a longing for God, and it sets him on the quest for communion with God. And it is this quote right here perfectly encapsulates what Augustine was doing. He knew that there is something there inside of him. He knows that there's something in the world, right? Some cosmic order, some creative beauty, not some impersonal order, but a beautiful, organic wholeness, right? That we have trouble seeing because the world is full of suffering and chaos. But he glimpses it as through a crack. And the story of the Confessions is the cracks where the light gets in. Quote Leonard Cohen, I guess. So you'd think, okay, great. Okay, as a young man, Augustine discovers Hortensius by Cicero. Quest is over, right? You found out that wisdom exists. Just grab it, right? Well, that's not how it works. Unfortunately, we have these things called our wills, and Augustine is very good on the power of habit. We all have habits. We have habits of sin, but even just whatever. I mean, they can just be bad habits. They're not necessarily associated with sin. We just go about our days in these sort of mindless ways. And here we'll read from Peter Brown, the biographer. He says, "What Augustine could not explain so easily was the fact that in practice the human will did not enjoy complete freedom. A man found himself involved in seemingly irreversible patterns of behavior, subject to compulsive urges to behave in a manner contrary to his good intentions, sadly unable to undo habits that had become established." So there's an image that Augustine sort of refers to. He just alludes to it in the briefest way. But he talks about the will being in this sticky substance called birdlime, which was I don't know if you know what this is, but it was a clear sticky substance that people would put on tree branches to catch birds. In some parts of the world, I think it's been outlawed by this point. But in many places in the world, they still use it. And what Augustine said is that our wills are like, they're caught in birdlime. And we're struggling to get free. But we can't do it on our own. We need something to dissolve the birdlime. And we're flapping our wings, right? We want to, burst our bonds. We want to get free from the cage. And we can't. We're just stuck. And so, even though Augustine, has discovered that there's this thing called the wisdom of God, he has many wrong turns. And this is where I'm going to try to go through the book as well as I can. But like Dr. Myers, it's hard to do justice to a book. This is a not a longer translation, but there are more pages in it than the one I usually use by Sarah Rudin. But it's a long tale, and the last 4 books of the Confessions are a philosophical reflection on the soul, memory, time, and eternity. But Augustine keeps taking wrong turns because he's stuck in birdlime. And how he gets out of it is, primarily the grace of God, but also through friendship and love. That he sees in other people what is good. The first group of people he sees goodness in is a group that is one of his wrong turns, actually. They're a group called the Manichees, who are they have a radically dualistic philosophy where they think the powers of good and evil duke it out, and maybe someday, the good God or the good demon of the world will win out versus the bad. But basically, we don't really, eventually it'll happen. But in human life, it's hard to know. But they show him, right, through little groups of friends, you can begin to understand the good. And if somebody especially is teaching you, is guiding you on the path. But eventually he realizes that their idea of evil is not sufficient, in that they think that evil is totally an external force. And so ultimately, you're not responsible for anything. You're not responsible for any wrong turns that you make, right? It's just this external, almost like demonic force that enters you, which Augustine would say, I mean, that's partially right, but also partially wrong. And so he keeps on joining these groups of friends. He moves from North Africa up to Rome. He tries to create basically like a little quasi-monastic retreat where a bunch of people live together and they're funded by one of their rich African friends, North African friends. But it breaks apart because people want to get married, or they have, like Augustine has a concubine, and he has a son with her, and everybody gets tied down and they can't make it work. So he moves to Milan. He discovers in the sermons of Ambrose the light of God. He often talks about the lamp of God shining outside, but also shining in our souls. And he sees an Ambrose, who he never fully befriends. He just sees him sort of from a distance. He sees something that he wants. But he keeps on saying, I can't give myself yet. I can't do it. He keeps trying to create little groups of friends. So read the next part here. So Peter Brown on Longing and Memory and Confessions. He says, all a man could do was to yearn for this absent perfection. You know there's something called goodness out there, and you want it, but you yearn for it. You can't quite have it. To feel its loss intensely, to pine for it. This marks the end of a long-established classical ideal of perfection. If to be a romantic means to be a man acutely aware of being caught in an existence that denies him the fullness for which he craves, to feel that he's defined by his tension towards something else, by his capacity for faith, for hope, for longing, to think of himself as a wanderer, and so on, then Augustine has imperceptibly become a romantic. He feels the longing intensely, but no fulfillment. Until he ends up in a garden. And, well, actually, right before he's in the garden, he hears a Christian talking about a Saint Anthony, who is a desert hermit. And he hears Anthony being talked about as a friend of God. He thinks, how can anybody be a friend of God? God is remote. God is transcendent. Whoever this God is. But for Augustine, it's the incarnation that makes you a friend of God. Because God came down to earth as both man and God. If you read the church fathers, Augustine especially, but Athanasius would be another good one to point to, the incarnation often carries much more weight than the crucifixion, and even at times the resurrection. Because it is that link, right? God dwelling among us. And he thinks, how do I become friends with God? And he's been battling it. I don't want to give myself. He goes into this garden. It's significant that it's in a garden. It's sort of like, the Garden of Eden, the showers of grace coming back to human society. And I don't have time to read it, but it's just this wonderful sort of 4 or 5 page passage. And it is the perfect combination of active and passive. Both surrender and act. He's with his friend Alypius. They're talking about what their friend had told him about Saint Anthony. And then all of a sudden Augustine says, I have to go by myself. I've got to go off by myself. And he starts weeping. And it's as if something is entering him. This grace that frees the soul. Right? And then he hears famously the children in the background playing some game he's never heard of before. They're saying, take up and read, take up and read. So he picks up the Bible and sees a passage that's exactly about sort of the fleshliness that weighs us down. And then he just loses it and commits himself at the same time. I think of something like, baptism, right, is both passive and active in a way, even if you're baptized as an infant. right? You're actively being brought by your parents before the church. If you're baptized as an adult believer, right, you're submitting yourself to baptism. It takes a choice, but also it is a passive act in which somebody drowns you and brings you back from the dead. And Augustine drowns in a flood of tears, and then he's brought back from the dead. And then, in a book right after that, he and his mother have a vision of God together, where for hours, or minutes at least, they experience this ecstatic union with God. It's right before his mother Monica dies, and she's one of those people whom he loved, who drew him to God. And the reason I bring this up is that both the conversion in the garden, he sort of goes off for himself for a time, and then he comes back to Alypius, his friend, and Alypius talks about how he's also committed himself to the universal church and submitted himself to the lordship of Christ. And then with his mother, they have this vision together. Right? In the modern world, we think of ourselves, right, as primarily just wayfaring pilgrims on the road by ourselves. But in both of these key moments, Augustine is with others. Right? It's almost as if it's shared conversion. Right? And we know from baptismal records in the ancient world, almost out of time here, right, that people, even today, right, people will go and everybody will get baptized, right, Easter. Right? It's the day. And people sometimes would wait years. They didn't think they were ready for baptism. And then they'd all, people would go together. So it's this shared, communal longing finding its fulfillment in Christ. And then the last thing I'll say about confessions, I'll grab my book, is that the last 4 books, which in some ways are my favorites, but they're very difficult compared to the earlier biographical or autobiographical sections. But they're about how the soul experiences eternity, right, and reflects upon it in an interior way. And for ancient people, there would be, as for us, right, there would be clear conversion narratives. It says, look, once I was lost, now I'm found. Right? So the last 4 books of Confessions would have frustrated many people, actually, in the ancient world. It said, look, you found what you were looking for. Have a party. You're done. Right? Now just live together in unity. But Augustine says, no, we're still fighting against the will. It goes on. We're still trying to understand who God is. It never stops. And so the last 4 books, 10 through 13, are just this constant struggle, and in ancient terms, an agon, a wrestling match, right? God's grace, our effort, our will, which now has been, in some ways, the bird lime has been, whatever, somebody's brought paint thinner or something like that. But it's still there to an extent, right? Do what I don't want to do. And so Augustine spends the last 4 books talking about how you still try to reach God. And toward the end of book 11, he talks about singing the Psalms or reciting the Psalms. And he says in a psalm you have sort of like a miniature experience of eternity. And that as a song is sung, as one of the psalms is sung, just take maybe Psalm 1 or 51 or 42 or whatever, right? It's a little experience of eternity because you hear and feel the song spilling out, and you try to retain the melody in your memory. And yet you can't quite hang on to the whole thing. But you're existing, you're singing, you're existing in the song, in the song. And as the people of God sing the Psalms together, or the cantor, or whoever would have been singing it or chanting it in the ancient world, you find yourself as part of this larger song of God's story. And I can always think of when I went to Notre Dame for graduate school, went to a little Presbyterian church. We sang through the Psalter all the time. We sang all the Psalms. And sometimes it was really annoying. You sing, a huge chunk of Psalm 119. You're just like, come on, I've sung this melody like 18 times already. Let's just end it and go to the sermon. But the month before I left that church, I was surrounded by all these people I'd sung the Psalms with for 6 years. And I looked around and I heard them singing. And I heard some of them harmonizing. They were singing parts to the Psalms and the Psalter. And I started crying. And I just tried to cover it up. Didn't want people to see me. Because I knew I was going to leave them. And yet I was going to carry this memory with me after I left. And it was a foretaste of heaven. And that's what Augustine's talking about. We extend ourselves into heaven as we sing, as we remember, and we're drawn back. We extend ourselves again, and we're drawn back. And that's what the Confessions is. That's how you find God. And you just keep doing that over and over. Okay? Oh, I took 3 extra minutes. Sorry. Okay.
So, again, the idea of these sessions is for us to be helpful to you as you teach these books. This is the first year we've done this, so we're sort of starting out guessing what might be helpful to you. But perhaps you know better than we do. So do you have questions about the Aeneid or about Augustine teaching them? Yes, sir.
As you were speaking, I kept hearing the Apostle Paul saying, "Wretched man that I am." So did he just re-say Paul's words, or is there a difference between the two men?
I mean, I think in many ways Augustine is the, emphasizing Paul's, wretched man that I am, who will save me from this body of death, right? I think that he just, he extends your understanding of Paul in a deeply interior way. And I don't know that he's really saying anything different. I don't think so. I think there are theologians who would say that he is, and that he's taking Paul in perhaps a more negative direction. But when I read Romans and 1 Corinthians and so on, other epistles, Galatians, it's the same thing, right? It's just, I'm fighting against the settled habits that I have. And Augustine, he lived in a world in which there were many different sort of varying sects of Christianity. And I think he ended up in, what he at that time was the Catholic Church, because it had the truly Pauline understanding of Christianity. Not to set Paul against Christ in any way, I'm not trying to do that, but I think that's why he ended up where he ended up, rather than the people he fought against, like the Pelagians, who basically thought that you could end up totally conquering the will in a more permanent way, not necessarily in the way like maybe Wesley would say it, where it's like this tiny moment, right? But they would say, like, you can make it, you could be perfect. And Augustine would say, no, that's not the Christian life. And so I think he's just extending and deepening the Pauline understanding of the self looking for salvation. Does that make,
Thank you.
Yeah, that's as best as I can understand it, at least. I'm an English professor, so Augustine is important to me. I'm not, a classicist.
So is there a connection, I guess, there between the two? Aeneas is seeking physical order and order in his community, and Augustine is seeking order in his soul.
Yeah.
Is that a good way to...
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the Aeneid, there's also, of course, in an ancient text, you don't have the kind of interior, or in an epic poem, I should say, you don't have the same kind of interior exploration you would get in a memoir, right? And Augustine is really unusual, even in the ancient world, for this sort of interiority. But there are still, even in the Aeneid, there are hints that the struggle for imperium is also, and perhaps even begins with, the struggle for self-imperium, for mastery over the self, which is really one of the best connections between the two, right? And so we didn't have time to get to it, but there's this famous problem at the end of the poem when Aeneas kills Turnus, this enemy whose land Aeneas is sort of butted into, arguably, right? And Turnus is defeated. He is, in fact, the word used there, sublectos, subdued. And then if you go back to Anchises' words to Aeneas, Anchises said to him, humble the proud and spare the subdued, the sublectos. And so Aeneas maybe loses the struggle for self-control at the end, right? Of course, Virgil dies before the poem is, completed, but we don't, know if that means perfected or revised, or if he would have written more. But yeah, so most of the time we see Aeneas wonderfully triumphing over this sort of over the will, right, over this inner chaos. But it's maybe even more wonderful that at the end he's a little bit more like the rest of us, and he perhaps fails in that. And then of course you have Augustine to sort of diagnose the failure.
Yeah, I think that's the right emphasis, but that the Aeneid explores interiority, but not at the same level. And Confessions explores the idea of imposing order through these small groups of friends. And then after Augustine goes back to North Africa, he becomes a bishop and creates a little monastery and basically just ends up training a whole bunch of priests and tries in some ways to impose order on a North African countryside and cities that are in some ways sort of breaking away from the old Roman order. And Augustine, as a bishop, has to intervene in all kinds of court cases and all kinds of things. So he too would be involved in political, civil, social order. But the emphasis for him is ultimately on the soul, I think. But both of them are not both.
Yeah, and it's funny, the Aeneid, many medieval readers of the Aeneid read it as a kind of allegory of the soul and the progress toward an ordered soul, with a fair bit of reading into going on, but the suggestions are there.
So if you were homeschooling high schooler and you were going to read the Aeneid, you're assigning it to them, but you don't have time to read it all. You're also doing drills, whatever, with other things. What section would you suggest the parent to go and read in depth and then to emphasize with their high school?
Yeah, oh, that's a good question. Yeah, because everyone knows cutting something is the most painful. Honestly, especially for that age, right? I would say the first half of the poem more than the second half. So the Aeneid is sort of, the first half imitates the Odyssey and is journey and struggle along the way. And the second half imitates the Iliad, and it's focused on the war in Italy, the battle for the land that would be Rome. Virgil clearly thought the second half of the poem was the most important part, but everyone else disagrees with him and tends to focus on those first books. So I would say book 1, book 2, probably skip book 3, book 4, maybe skip book 5, but book 5 is the best sports writing in the ancient world. So if you have a kid who is into that, right, you might want to hit book 5, and then book 6. And from there, then you can really just kind of skip to the end of book 12.
I was just thinking to myself, do you think Jesus saw Virgil's dilemma between love and duty, and then he combined both of them?
Yeah, wow. Jesus see the dilemma between love and duty? Yeah, I mean, of course, being Jewish, right? He probably thought in terms of law, right, and duty. This is where I'm wandering wildly outside of my purview, and so it has a lot to say on the reconciliation of those things, I think. Yeah, and I think coming back to Augustine sort of speaking on Jesus' behalf, I think we do see that reconciliation there. I mean, one thing I usually do teaching Roman literature is sort of juxtapose Virgil's emphasis of order and duty with Ovid's view of the universe driven by love, by eros, sort of by desire, one thing for another. And then I ask the students really trick question style, like, who's right? Is the universe all about order, or is it all about desire, right? And then, of course, we come around in a few weeks and we read the Confessions, and the answer is, oh, look, it's both. That these two sort of organizing principles are reconciled in the Christian vision of love and order.
What's a good version of Confessions to use? Like, we talk about Lombard Pardini, like, is there a recommended one?
Yeah, so I read this new one by Sarah Rudin recently, and I thought it was good for the first 9 books. It's sort of easier to follow, colloquial kind of, and then when I started reading through the philosophical books, I didn't like it at all, and I went back to the Oxford by Henry Chadwick, translated by Henry Chadwick, because he's just much more precise, which I think makes the philosophical meditations easier to follow. Whereas Rudin's kind of meandering, and it worked fine for the first 9 books, the autobiography, but then after that I got a bit frustrated. So that's probably not a satisfying answer. I'd probably say go with the Chadwick, the Oxford World's Classics. Yeah.
Confession is so deeply reflective. In his perspective is like, wow, here he is, this grown adult, like looking way back into his youth, at the start, and then we start this journey back through. One of the pitfalls for contextualization in teaching, maybe high school students, young college, there's just some things that are so embedded in his context that because it's a memoir, it's not really unpacked. Maybe the danger of becoming too prescriptive of his own reflective description is.
So how to contextualize, say, sort of like, here's the culture he comes out of, here's how we need to understand.
What would you say were maybe like the top 2 or 3 things to be like, hey.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the first most important thing is just to talk about what you might call the enchanted world, which I think our world is enchanted too. We just don't see it a lot of the time. And one of Peter Brown's other books called The Body and Society, he talks a lot about eating practices in the ancient world, especially for ascetic people, like people who are following some kind of monastic path. And he talks about like how, what they would perceive as dangerous about eating and why they'd be regulating their bodily practices so much. And he gives this example of like eating meat as being something you really need to watch out for. And he says for the people in North Africa or parts of the Roman Empire, they would think that there are spirits either hovering around the meat as you're eating it, or actually in it itself, and you'll be ingesting it. And then Brown says something like the unruly belches and loud farts that have come after are actually like the spirits exiting your body, and you need to regulate those spirits. And I think like I've taught that to freshmen, and they kind of get a kick out of it, So just to say, like, look, in very literal, tangible ways, they sort of see body and soul, body and spirit as very connected, and to do a little bit of reading on, what what that was like. Somebody like Brown, but there are various other classicists, people like Chadwick, Kyle Harper is a classicist at OU, who's written a lot about this time period. That's one thing. And then the second thing would just be sort of like the mystical path to God, which is so important in this period all the way up until the Renaissance. And then the period I specialized in, sort of the Enlightenment, is when everybody starts to clamp down on that sort of mysticism. But the inkling Charles Williams, in talking about Dante's Divine Comedy, talks about the pilgrim as being engodded through the course of the 3 books. And I think the Confessions is the same thing. It's an engodding, that God comes into you, right? And communion with God is that these practices that cultivate God, an awareness of God in the soul, and the prayer and fasting and the sacraments, and even what you eat is integral to that mystical path to God. So, like, any number of different things. Just reading the Divine Comedy, talking through it, or somebody like Charles Williams, any number of books, scholarly books, I'd say by C.S. Lewis would be helpful in that respect. Those 2 things, that's sort of what I'd suggest.
I think we are out of time. We want to give you time to refresh yourselves before the next session, but if there are any other ways we can help you, then don't hesitate to reach out to us. And thanks for joining us. Thank you.